Well, thanks to Representative Westerman. My name is Fred Cubbage, and I'm a professor at North Carolina State University, and I'm the president of the Society of American Foresters for this year. And as Dave said, we're pleased to welcome you all to really this first Society of American Foresters Hagenstein Lecture. And you'll have to forgive me, actually, our first speaker, actually, I think is not here today. He actually came all the way from Oregon and then is ill, so he didn't make it at the start. But we'll move into the second session in a minute here. John Barnwell gave me notes to talk to him. As a professor, I'm used to talking for 50 minutes as a usual lecture, but so John wanted to rein me in a little bit. Actually, I teach on Tuesdays and Thursdays, so I talk for 75 minutes actually at a time. But I'll stick with the notes pretty much here, and we'll try to stay on task. This is really, again, the first lecture series that we've held here in Washington. There already is a parallel series of this that was started at the World Forestry Center in Oregon. They actually had their first meeting last year. Rick Zinn is here. I lost him. He was in the back. Okay, he got up and wandering around here on us. And they're holding another one on October 15th, which is Sunday in about 12 days or so here as well, which is kind of a parallel part of this series. And as long as I get an extra minute, I'll sort of echo Dave's comments about our commitment to forestry, to the Society of American Foresters, and really to sustainable forestry. I'm a professor, so I don't get to practice quite as much as Dave does, not every day, but I taught actually at Georgia for about 10 years and had some timberland down there for about 23 years, and can say that we did manage it sustainably. Actually, we planted probably 80 acres of timberland, and we've harvested probably all of that 80 acres and thinned it maybe several times before we eventually sold it. But the advantage of it being sustainable was that really we sold it for essentially the price of the land plus the value of the timber that we had on there. So basically by being good stewards rather than perhaps being mercenary and leaving a cutover tract, really you capture the values and you're providing all those benefits for the long run as well. So I think it's a good story and consistent with the theme of the working forest of this session here today. So I won't introduce Dylan, but let me at least mention a little bit about him. He is an effective communicator, and he's actually head of the policy director of Sustainable Northwest Forest in Portland, and is again working with working forest in Portland and on the West Coast. And to continue a little bit, let's talk about Bill Hagenstein in particular. Okay, so that's the lecture series. We have the little logo. I just heard from Rick the story on the logo here, which is the Hagenstein Lectures. And that, if you look closely, I didn't figure it out right. That's a log with an H in the middle, and then actually a little insect borer in the bottom. So I guess Bill's little story was that it's an advantage to have this, better to utilize these logs than to have them eaten up by insects. And his little logo that he would use as his timber marker was actually that type of logo specifically. So it's kind of an interesting story on the side about that. But Bill is really a focus on working in effective communications. That's what's the point of these series, is try to convey the story of forestry more effectively. And that was his passion. And he left a large gift, both to the World Forestry Center and to the SAF, to convey that message really in perpetuity, essentially. So that's really where we're going with this lecture series. So our first panel now will be hosted by Bettina Ring, who came up all the way from Charlottesville, I guess, to attend this meeting. I actually came up from Richmond, where my son lives, on the train yesterday. So it's a great state, wonderful place to visit. Washington is the same, right? So. Bettina is the state forester for the Virginia State Forestry Association, or division, rather, excuse me, with the state. And she's been a leader in the Society of American Foresters and in forestry for maybe a couple of decades, but I'm sure no longer than that. She was deputy state forester in Virginia before leaving Virginia, and then went to different non-government organizations and government organizations as well. And she worked in natural resources and conservation, including the Colorado Coalition of Land Trusts, the Wilderness Land Trust, and the Bay Open Space Council. Before she became the state forester of Virginia, she also was senior vice president of family forests at the American Forest Foundation, centered here in Washington, D.C. And of course, as we know, forests are important to the Society of American Foresters, and really I think having Bettina and her panel will tell us about the importance of working forest and to the society and the professional society of foresters, and help bring it together about how we integrate the profession with the management of the forest and the importance of the forest really to society as well. So with that, I'll turn this over to Bettina and look forward to your panel, and you have a few extra minutes at that if you all want to talk. Not 15 minutes, but a few more. So thank you, Bettina.
Good morning. It's great to be with you this morning, and I'd like to invite our panelists to come up front, join us. We have with us this morning Tom Crowder with the Arkansas family. He's a family forest owner. We have Dave Tenney. I've been spending a lot of time with Dave in the last few weeks and other forestry meetings with the National Alliance of Forest Owners, and also Patrick Harrigan with Harrigan Lumber Company. So to start today, I just wanted to have a chance to sort of build on the remarks that have been shared with us. It's exciting to be part of this series. I'm so excited that we're doing that. Thank you. That we are doing this not only here and elsewhere across the nation, but in Oregon. I think it's very important, and we certainly heard from Representative Westerman about the critical nature of us being engaged, especially here in Washington, D.C. I think to start with, and as I mentioned, I've been on the road with Rick Cantrell and with Dave Tenney and others as we've had the National Association of State Foresters meeting in the last couple of weeks and the Sustainable Forestry Initiative Conference in Ottawa, Canada. And I had a family wedding this weekend, so I've had this sort of back-to-back travel, and I was able to squeeze out such a gorgeous weekend, and I love this time of year, and so I was able to squeeze out about 15 or 20 minutes to just get out in the hammock on Sunday afternoon, preparing for another week of travel, and was looking up. I've always enjoyed looking up at the silhouette of trees from a young age, and I was just noticing the various hardwood trees that I was looking at and feeling very grateful to be in this profession, knowing that I know those trees. I could quickly identify those trees and thought back to my dendrology class at Virginia Tech. But you don't have to necessarily know the Latin names of trees to love them and to love forests. And for me, I knew from a young age, I fell in love with trees and forests. I grew up in a very rural community and lived next door to my grandparents. I spent all the time, my time playing outdoors as a child, climbing trees, playing in the stream. We lived in the country, but we also had a 40-acre parcel and inholding within the Jefferson National Forest that we shared with my aunt and uncle. We would spend our weekends there and our summers there, and again, climbing trees, establishing wildlife food plots. My uncles and my father would hunt. My grandmother was actually a hunter as well and taught me how to hunt and fish. And so my family had a very strong land ethic, and I was very grounded in forestry from a young age, and I knew that this is what I wanted to do with my career. I also worked for the U.S. Forest Service and the YCC crew when I was in high school, and then had the good fortune of studying forestry at Virginia Tech. Go Hokies, despite the loss this past weekend. But I think that thinking back to, for all of you in the room, I'm sure you have similar stories, and I think that's where it all begins, and we hopefully will be able to provide those opportunities for future generations, and to make that happen, we certainly need working forests. And I'd like to start today's panel by asking our panelists to share their story of what attracted them to forests and forestry.
My professional experience started when I was around 8 years old, following my father in the woods. He would find an old stump and let me sit on the stump and disappear into the woods and call out tree measurements to me, and I would tally them on cards and collect inventory data. And only a couple times I had to find the nearest tree to climb up to avoid feral hogs in the area. But I was hooked from the very beginning, and so I graduated from the University of Arkansas at Fayetteville in agricultural business, which, not unlike Representative Westerman, I also was a walk-on to the University of Arkansas football program, so we both share those pains, same pains. I also went to the forestry department in Monticello, Arkansas, where I got a master's degree in natural resource management. As I mentioned, I'm a third-generation forester. I still help advise our family and extended family on how to take care and become good stewards of the properties that we have. We managed not only the timber, but also the multiple facets that come with timberland. So the air, water, wildlife, habitat, wildlife. I'm hooked and really enjoy it. Happy to be here.
Thank you, Tom. And you, Dave?
Good morning. My name is Dave Tenney. I'm the president and CEO of the National Alliance of Forest Owners. I think that I can trace my love of forestry to my childhood. I grew up in Idaho. I spent my youth playing in the forests of central and northern Idaho. Many wonderful experiences there. My professional experience began with my undergraduate degree, where my emphasis was early 20th century Jewish feminist authors, with a minor focusing on a comparative relationship with East German Jewish authors. That has nothing to do with forestry, but everything to do with with learning how to think critically and ask questions. Coming out of law school, I had the privilege of quite by accident, as these things happen around this town, working for a member of Congress who had 10 national forests in his district. I was the resources guy. So that began a nearly 24-year-long love affair with the policy around forestry. And I've learned a lot from a lot of people asking questions. And my experience has enabled me to associate with the best and the brightest wonderful people who are passionate about the profession of forestry, about our natural resources, about all the wonderful things that they do to improve our lives. I did have a wonderful opportunity to work in the administration. I served as the Deputy Undersecretary for Natural Resources and Environment, which put me in direct contact daily with the U.S. Forest Service. Learned to love the professionals who work in that wonderful agency, and not only feel their passion, but feel their pain. It taught me a lot about how difficult it is to manage our nation's resources, especially one that is so precious that people write poems about trees. You can't help but feel passionate about the resource. And here I am now, representing an organization that combined, I think it encompasses about 80 million acres of private forest land across the country. Any place where there are trees, there are members of NAFO. And we feel very passionately about this resource. It's a source of income. It's a source of livelihood. It's a source of place and identity. And it provides wonderful, wonderful benefits to Americans all over the country. Anytime you go out in the woods, you know what I'm talking about. And I suspect that many of you have spent time in the woods. We love wood. We love trees. We love all the things that they can do for us and the way they improve our lives. And that's probably going to be with me for the rest of my life. These things die hard. And we do what we do because we're passionate about it. And so especially grateful to be here with Bettina. I will make one comment that will be important to you. In my backyard, I have bottomland hardwoods. It's a typical oak hickory forest. We have oak, we have soft maple, we have hickory trees, we have tulip poplar trees. We have a whole variety of wonderful species, all of which I can identify, including the ash trees that have been eaten by the emerald ash borer. There are about half a dozen of those. But I've been able to identify these using the tool that the Virginia Department of Forestry provides to help you identify the trees in your state, and in this case, in my backyard. So thank you for that.
Great, thank you. Happy to be your state forester and to have you in our backyard. It's wonderful. Thank you for your leadership. Patrick.
I'm Patrick Harrigan. As Bettina said, I'm one of the hats I wear, I guess, is I'm the president of Harrigan Lumber Company, which is a family-owned sawmill in Monroeville, Alabama, a very rural community in southwest Alabama. My family also has several other operations. I'm actually the third generation at Harrigan Lumber Company, the fourth generation in the sawmill business in Alabama. My family's been in it for over 100 years now. And my nephew is working with me now, so that's the fifth generation of our family that's now moving into the business. We own a fair amount of timberland, not quite 80 million acres, but we do own a fair amount of timberland. We also have logging operations and a timberland management company. So we don't think of ourselves as a vertically integrated company, but it seems like we are, to some extent at least. I'm also representing the Southeastern Lumber Manufacturers Association. I'm the chairman for this year. And the organization represents primarily family-owned sawmills in the U.S. South, and represents their interest both in Washington and other areas as well. So it kind of seems like I got into this industry, didn't have much choice but to get into this industry, being fourth generation, but it's probably a little different than a lot of people. I didn't go to forestry school. I grew up working in the summers with our forestry folks, and I was always the guy that had to do the grunt work, and decided pretty early on I didn't really want to be in the forest every day. So I graduated from Auburn University with a degree in business, and decided to come back into the manufacturing side of the business, and I've been there ever since. And great industry, a lot of good people, and fell in love with it. Still there.
Thank you very much. So wonderful stories, and as Dave mentioned, forests not only provide all these amazing products that we all benefit from, but it really is about place and identity. And so these stories, I think, really touch on the identity and how we all feel connected in our families, multiple generations. So thank you for sharing your stories. Very rich and much more to share as this panel progresses. When we think about how abundant our forests are and the sustainable forests that we have here in America, we are very fortunate and grateful. We're grateful to be able to have folks that are professionals that are so passionate about this profession and really care not only about the forests but about each other. When you look across the U.S., so many various benefits that the forests bring to us, and if you look at the southern region, we're the wood basket of the world, and so with that comes a responsibility and an obligation. And so when we think about the contributions to our rural communities, the contributions to clean air and clean water, our drinking water that everyone depends on, the wildlife habitat that we all enjoy, the various species across our nation, and the variety of recreational opportunities, this wouldn't be possible without healthy, abundant forests. We often hear the word stewardship as it relates to forests and forestry, and it has different meanings for different people. So I'd like to ask our panelists, if they can, to describe what forest stewardship means to them, the place that they come from. And I'd like to start with Tom as a family forest owner.
Sure, that's it, yeah. So stewardship to me means a passion for the land, a passion for taking care of the land and all of the abundant resources that that exist on these properties. And so it's not just the forest itself, it's stewardship to the community that these properties and landscapes surround. So it really starts with a passion for taking care of the property, managing the property, so the next generation and the next generation have this sustainable resource to enjoy. So oftentimes foresters we're planting more trees than we're harvesting, and we're not necessarily planting a tree that our generation is going to benefit from, but we're actually planting a tree for our children or our children's children are going to benefit from. These generational type forest systems, it takes a active management approach, and not just for the trees, but for the soil, the water, the air, and the communities. That's what stewardship means to me.
Thank you. Dave?
Well, stewardship really has two important aspects, at least, for the members of NAFO and for me personally. One thing that I really enjoy about working with our membership is how they feel about the resource. We often joke that people get into forestry because they like being in the woods. And you can tell an extroverted forester because they'll look at your shoes while they're talking to you rather than their own. And but that's where it comes from. And so when I have the privilege of working with our members, we talk about the resource, and they recognize, and I think we all recognize that the public, the people that we work with, our neighbors, our communities, care about some basic things. When we manage this resource, are we doing it in a way that will help keep our water clean? Are we doing it in a way that will help keep our air clean? Are we doing it in a way that will enable us to take care of wildlife? Because they're our neighbors too. Are we doing it in a way that enables a community to thrive, to provide jobs, managing a business so that people can go home and feel secure at night? These are all part of stewardship, and they have a lot to do with our natural environment, but they also have a lot to do with our people environment, our social environment. And one of my favorite experiences that I have in this job is going out and talking to our members and actually visiting where they live and work. We have companies that have been around for over 150 years and have been serving their community and being a part of their community as good citizens for 150 years. And they're very proud of what they do. They're engaged in the community. They're engaged in the schools. They're engaged in the hospitals. They're engaged in the leadership of the communities where they live and serve. And it's very inspiring to see that. And as they look to the future, these companies have been around for a long time, want to be around for another 150 years. And that takes a very enlightened forward view. And that takes a stewardship ethic second to none.
I don't know if there's a whole lot I can really add to what both of you guys said. It's kind of a similar thing for me. As I said, we're going into our 5th generation, and you don't get to that point by not taking care of your resources and managing them well. And a lot of our timberland, we're on the 3rd rotation of that timberland. If we didn't manage that resource well, then we wouldn't be where we are today. I have 2 daughters that love to hunt. We're an outdoors family, and we enjoy our property. And I want them to be able to enjoy that property. I want their children and their children to be able to enjoy that property. And I think most people in this industry are kind of those type of people that they enjoy the outdoors, and they want future generations to be able to enjoy it as well. And again, we, as you said, we want our company to be around for years and years, and we want to pass that on to future generations. And you don't do that without taking care of that resource and managing it well, and having it provide for the next generation, as our forebears did the same for us. So.
Thank you. Those are all excellent responses. And thinking about, let's tease that a little bit more, and thinking about some specifics, because we've had great track records. I think your family business certainly is a great demonstration of looking long term. Thinking about 3rd generation for you. So we do many things where we've had some great success stories as it relates to sustainable forest management. Thinking about water quality, best management practices, the non-regulatory approach that we've had across the South that's been very effective. In Virginia, we're within the Chesapeake Bay watershed, and right now we have 98% compliance with best management practices because we care about protecting water quality and still actively managing our forests. So thinking about that, and then also some of the success stories that we've had around wildlife habitat and longleaf restoration, for example, that ecosystem, and being able to bring back red cockaded woodpecker, gopher tortoise, and other species of value. Anything that you would like to share as far as specific examples from any of you as it relates to how we've really been able to demonstrate sustainable forest management?
I think Patrick made a good point that there's not an alternative to sustainability, that reforestation, taking care of the water, the riparian aspects of the forest, planning diversification, utilizing the soil to its maximum capabilities. All of those are interconnected, addressing how communities are affected with the properties as well, not just experiencing it from the outside, but I think of local community members that actually recreate on properties that we manage in a sustainable way is also a critical factor.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Others?
I think it's important to realize that managing the forest is also the way to manage a lot of these species that you spoke of, the red cockaded woodpecker and gopher tortoise. And it's working forest is actually where a lot of these species thrive. And if you just leave those forests to their own devices, as a lot of people want to do, then you're actually going to end up harming those species in the long run. Keeping those, and for certain species, keeping the regularly burning the timberland is actually beneficial for a lot of species. And a lot of people don't realize how much wildlife benefit and ecological benefit that the forest industry does provide by actively managing those forests. And I think that's certainly something we need to, probably a story we don't tell enough.
I like to think of, in the sphere in which I operate, I like to think often about how those who are charged with safeguarding our natural resources in government respond to us. And I have two examples that I think indicate how that relationship works. One is an EPA experience. The EPA is charged, among other things, with keeping our water clean and helping to make sure that, that water quality is always kept at a high level. And as we've worked with the Environmental Protection Agency, they regularly cite what we do with our water quality best management practices as an example of how the Clean Water Act works, a good example. So much so that they prefer the best management practices that are developed by the states over a regulatory regime. And they've stated that in their policy. It's a very remarkable thing. It's a demonstration of trust. And it's a demonstration of how these partnerships, state, private, and federal, can work. Another example is in the Endangered Species Act. This is the caring for species at risk, whether they are listed or not, is an important part of stewardship. And one of the things that gives me great satisfaction, I think gives our staff great satisfaction, is the proactive position our members have taken. They are working proactively, putting over 40 million acres of their land on the table to work with the Fish and Wildlife Service to do projects to help identify how to care for species at risk so they don't have to be listed. And that's a project that's ongoing and that's unfolding as we work with the agencies to build trust and just show how this can and should be done. And that happens not by chance. It happens because one at a time, that ethic is instilled into the present and in the future generation. And then it's played out in our interactions with government at the state and local and the federal level.
Yeah, and just to add, when you look at species like the gopher, tortoise, or red cockaded woodpecker, private land is very in probably all cases butts up to private land. And I think it's important that policies exist to support private landowners' pursuits to enhance the wildlife habitat, because a red cockaded woodpecker is not necessarily going to stop when it gets to an ownership change. And so I think it's important that there's an educational component to private land ownership, but also the incentives to help create an environment where private landowners can recognize and basically get the help that they need to take care of those unique habitats. So for red cockaded woodpecker and gopher tortoise, I think you even look at species that are in the ground and look at longleaf pine versus loblolly, which is all categorized as southern yellow pine, but certain system creating incentives for pine diversification, species diversification, and That's one of those interconnected between the trees that our foresters are growing and the habitat that they're trying to protect as well.
Thank you. So partnership, certainly knowing that invasive species, knowing that species do not stop at that boundary, it's really important. It calls upon us to work across all lands, being able to bring tools that are available to us. In Virginia, we recently signed the Good Neighbor Authority Agreement with the George Washington and Jefferson National Forests, so that's going to allow us to do more work together around forest health and fuels reduction, being able to think more broadly and deeply about the landscape. Certainly there are many tools in the toolbox, and we need those tools. In the states, we actually put a forest action plan together. We also work with our sister agencies in wildlife to look at wildlife action plans and where are our priorities and how do we work in those landscapes. And those help us really be more intentional about our work, which Dave was alluding to. When we look at the Farm Bill and the fact that we're now in the process of looking at how do we continue the tools that have worked, how do we put some new tools in place, making sure that we have incentives for landowners and that we have cost share and that we are able to provide those opportunities and those tools to private landowners in particular is extremely important. Another tool that's very important in that toolbox is taxes. As state forester in Virginia, when I look across the state, we have quite a bit of fragmentation. One of our biggest issues in parcelization, or if you talk to Brett Butler, it's parcelation, the correct pronunciation of that. We're losing approximately 16,000 acres of forest land in Virginia each year. And so we've tried to bring all the tools to bear to try to address that, and it can be very challenging. We have a program called Generation Next that is basically focused on estate planning for landowners, and we're expanding that program across the state so that we can work with other family forest owners that want to be able to keep that land in their families, and it's not as easy as it used to be. And so thinking about those tools that we need to have in that toolbox to make sure that that's possible, taxes play an extremely important role. I'd like to hear from our panelists from their perspective, and they all come at this from a very different place, a landowner, a business owner, looking at large landowners across the U.S., the role that they see as far as taxes.
Sure, I'll start off. Tax policies can have a dramatic impact on a forest system, and it's not just the family that has a tax burden, but also the communities where those properties are located can be changed dramatically because of tax policies. It's important. One of the most important things is that we're able to take a forest and apply good stewardship and pass it to our next generation. And oftentimes when a tax burden and that transition from one generation to another can create a situation on paper that ends up having a dramatically negative impact on those communities. It's important that policies exist to help that transfer to where there's not the necessity or incentives that are going to create deviating from these generational type management plans, whether it accelerating harvest in properties in order to pay a very large estate tax bill when what's in the best interest of the forest might not be to go and remove all of the timber, but in order to preserve the land, oftentimes those are steps that difficult decisions that families have to make in order to preserve their land. Sure.
Well, a little while back, anticipating that the little old subject of tax might become important to this institution and one across the street, we gathered as members of NAFO and asked ourselves a simple question: what, of all the provisions in the tax code, are most impactful on our ability to be stewards of this resource? That was basically the question, and you always get, you're asked in every office, oh, we're going to do tax reform, what are you willing to give up? We give up everything, except for those things that were most essential to helping us maintain our stewardship. And there are a few provisions of the tax code that are absolutely critical of that, that recognize a couple of things. One, recognize the nature of what forest land is and what trees are, that this is a long-term investment. It's a long-term capital investment. It's an asset that is a capital gains type of an asset. And recognizing that in the code is really essential to be able to develop your business model and take risks over a long time. And the second is that during that long time, you don't plant a tree today and then tomorrow or the next day or next week return your investment. You may plant a tree today and it may come in 25 years. It may come in 40 years. It may come in 80 years, depending on where your trees are and where what you're growing. During that time, you still have to make investments. You still have to invest in the land. You still have to pay your taxes. You still have to do all the things that you would do as an owner of a resource and a manager of a business. And so the tax code accounts for that too, enables you to do the deductions that are necessary to have an ongoing business. And then another that's absolutely critical is that we want to encourage reforestation at every level, big, small, in between. And there are provisions of the tax code that make it, that enable forestation, especially for those who may find that outlay particularly difficult. And if you look at all this, it is premised on this whole notion of what trees are, and that they're this long-term asset, and it needs to be treated. It's a real property interest that needs to be treated as that long-term asset. And in the code, those few provisions of the code recognize that. So we're willing to give up all the others, at least we think, until we see the blueprint and see the details. But those are the ones that have been most essential to us.
Thank you.
Yeah, just kind of following on what you said, I think a lot of people on the Hill seem to be, they understand farming more than they do forestry, I think a lot of times. And you know, with row crops, you plant them, and in a few months you harvest them, and you know, maybe the weather's not good, so you don't have a good harvest that season, but there's always the next one, right? And if you don't harvest it, then you have crop insurance, and that'll help cover those losses. We don't have any of that in the forest products industry. It's, you know, you plant it, as you said, it can be decades before you realize that investment. And if a wildfire or a hurricane or tornado comes along and destroys your crop, there's no insurance. And so it's certainly a long-term investment. It's a risky investment to a certain extent. And yeah, I think tax policy needs to recognize that fact, that it is a very long-term investment. On the manufacturing side of things, especially with a lot of the sawmills in the U.S. being family-owned, certainly those estate tax issues are very important. There was a sawmill, a new sawmill announced recently. A company's going to invest $100 million into a sawmill. I certainly wouldn't want to invest $100 million into a sawmill in this today, but a lot of these family-owned mills are mills that have been owned for generations, and they started small and they've grown, and they are very valuable companies at this point. And when one generation passes and has to pass that asset on to the next generation, tax policy is very important in being able to keep that company in the family. And timberland's very much the same way. You know, it's affected by the estate tax. And so I know there's a lot of talk about repealing the estate tax, which is great, but we also have, you know, other things around that where, you know, the step up in basis where, you know, when it passes to the next generation, you can kind of reset your starting value, and so that if assets are sold, then you're not realizing this huge tax hit all at one time. And all of those kind of things, I think if there was one message that I could kind of get across to the Hill, it's that tax policy, when it gets back down to the local level, there's so many effects that you might not realize sitting in Washington. That there's so many unintended consequences that can come from tax policy, and I think it's very important that you know, the staff in Washington is speaking to those local landowners and business owners to understand, you know, the negative ramifications of any changes that we make.
Thank you. It is easy to take those things for granted, especially when you're removed from the forest or from business in the forest products industry. And so it takes all of those pieces, and that connection is extremely important. You mentioned, Patrick, community and being connection down at the local level and the impact of that. So let's talk a little more about community and the role that the forest products industry and small businesses play, the role that small private forest landowners play as it relates to making sure that we have vibrant communities and healthy forests across our nation. If you look at what's happening across the U.S. and some of the discussions you heard earlier today, certainly forests are very vital to a healthy rural economy. In Virginia, we just recently completed our economic study. We try to update that on a regular basis, and we're the number 3, the third largest industry in Virginia. I was hoping we would surpass and actually pass tourism, and that didn't happen this year, but we're on their heels. And so combined with agriculture, we're number 1, and we're very proud of that. So 108,000 jobs for us in Virginia, $21 billion to Virginia's economy. Our governor, Governor Terry McAuliffe, has been a strong supporter of ag and forestry. He's worked very hard with the Secretary of Commerce and Trade and the Secretary of Agriculture and Forestry to promote forestry abroad. He has done quite a bit to increase exports, and he's also worked hard to provide grant programs for small businesses so that they can expand or new businesses can move into Virginia. And so we're proud of that. We do believe it's really important to keep forests as forests, so being able to have the incentives that we've been talking about, from taxes to having the right conservation programs in the Farm Bill, making sure that landowners can keep their land forested and pass that on in their families. Working with the governor last year, we passed the first ever century forest legislation in Virginia, and so that allows us to recognize those families that have kept the land in their family for over 100 years. And so we were really excited when we first announced that program. We had 23 landowners automatically that applied, and we celebrated in Montpelier. And we had quite a bit of diversity within those landowners. And so we're going to continue that program and really showcasing and highlighting those important steps that those families have taken, because it is very challenging. We also work very closely with the Black Family Land Trust, and the U.S. Endowment for Forests and Communities has been very actively involved across the South as it relates to African American land retention. But we have programs across the U.S. in the West and in the Northeast that helps us make sure that we're keeping forests as forests. And it's extremely important for all the benefits that we've been discussing. So I'd love to hear, we talked earlier about the connections and just how connected we all are. I'd love to hear from our panelists how the relationship exists between loggers and industry, the businesses, the sawmills, the larger industries, the forest landowners, the communities. It was mentioned earlier, it is even important that the mayors be engaged in ensuring that we have healthy, sustainable forests across America. And so, if you will, please share with us those connections and how they make a difference.
Yeah. Actually, the other day, just was kind of doing a little research, and I looked at, within our county, in Monroe County, Alabama, the top 15 or so employers. And on that list, there was one textile industry that's one of our larger employers. And then all forest products companies or government entities, or I think the hospital was on the list, and maybe a nursing home. And it kind of hits home that if it weren't for those forest products related jobs in that county, that hospital wouldn't be providing all those jobs. The school system and the county commission wouldn't be providing those jobs. So, you know, in our rural area, I would venture to guess that at least 80%, if not more, of the jobs in that area are forest products related. In the state of Alabama, forestry is the #1 industry. And, you know, it's, like you said, it goes back to, you know, all the way back to the mayor, and everybody is certainly interconnected. And yeah, if it wasn't for the forest products industry, I think rural Alabama essentially wouldn't exist. And I think that the same can be said for communities all across the country. If you drive through rural areas, what do you drive through? You're either driving through forest land or it's some type of agricultural land. And so those two industries are really the backbone of rural America, and certainly very, very important in our area, for sure.
And the impact in the Western Gulf South, there's many family-owned milling operations, and I visit when I have the opportunity with many of them. That transfer from second to third generation is a very large transition to make. And when a family milling operation leaves the family or gets shut down, it doesn't just affect the family. It's a community, and those communities were started with milling operations, and those communities can go down completely off the map. So it's critical to keep those communities thriving and have the local economy that exists. There's 21 million private landowners in the United States. 1 in 4 of those is located in rural America, and it's critical that we're able to continue to manage these resources and help them to transition, because they not only serve the communities, but they're incredible resources for the state. Yeah.
Thank you.
First of all, I thought that the number one industry in Alabama was football. So this is an important clarification. Okay. But I do relate to these comments quite a bit. I'll tell you a little story about a table. We have a table in our office. It's a conference table. It's made out of Douglas fir. It was grown by a family-owned company in Washington, state of Washington. And so this is a company that's been around for 154 years, and they grew this tree on their land. And we were looking for some tangible, beautiful thing to put in our office from one of our members, and so they offered to harvest a tree and mill it and help us turn it into a table. But the story of how that tree got to our office is really a story of the value chain in many ways. That tree was harvested by our member, Port Blakely Companies, but it was milled by a young woman named Katie Wilcox, who bought a portable mill, and she's working her way through college operating this portable mill. So she sawed this tree up into slabs and dried it, and then contracted with a trucker to send it across the United States. So the trucker then had to put this wood on the back of his long bed and carry it across the United States to a fellow by the name of Scott Carpenter, very well named, very aptly named fellow, in Berryville, Virginia, who then turned these slabs of wood into the beautiful conference table that we have now, and then delivered it to our office. That's just one example. There are many examples of how the value chain works in our sector. It requires those who grow, it requires those who harvest, those who transport and haul, and those who manufacture, and then those who turn those manufactured products into goods and services that people can use. They get them to the market to improve our lives. Each one of those steps is vital. Each one is important, and there's probably a significant policy nexus with each one of those. And so as we're looking at this value chain, we care about every piece of it. You pick up one end of the stick, you kind of pick up both ends of the stick. And because of that, you find that in our sector, especially as we're talking about the things that we make that make people's lives better, there's a lot of unity, really. We have very close relationships with our allies. We work together, and there's quite a bit of unity there, because we recognize that you can't look at just one piece of the picture. The entire picture is important.
Yeah. When I was looking through that list of our largest employers, one of them was a trucking company. And that trucking company actually got its start by hauling chips for our mill when our mill started up. And it's now one of the largest employers in the county. And they make most of their business is hauling forest products or byproducts from mills. And so again, all these businesses are interrelated, and we've kind of seen with when the housing bubble burst, certainly the forest products industry was hit very hard, and we've kind of seen a kind of a micro example of what happens. Our community was hit very hard during that, and a lot of people even today are driving 70, 80 miles to work because they were laid off and still haven't been able to find jobs. But fortunately, those jobs are coming back, and we're looking for ways to bring even more jobs back to the community.
So we are all interdependent, and we need each other, and we all need to care about this issue, no matter what hat we're wearing, what role we're playing in this value chain. If you think about, we've talked a lot about the rural economy. Forests play a very important role in our urban communities as well, as it relates to our health, contribution to public health. And Dave mentioned Berryville and the piece of wood that was actually sawn there and became the table in his conference room. We also have to think about those trees that we need to utilize in urban and suburban areas so that they don't end up in a landfill, and we're putting more attention to that as well. And that supports a local community in a different way and supports local artisans as well. There are a number of products, as we mentioned, that come from the forest, and we're also expanding our work as it relates to agroforestry. And so if you look in Oregon, in the Pacific Northwest, mushrooms, really important there, throughout the nation. But I think there's more and more emphasis by restaurants and chefs on foraging, and so we have, again, a need that can be met through forests. And looking at pine straw in South Carolina and other states in the South, looking at berries that are grown, working with Virginia Tech, we're doing a lot around agroforestry and experimenting with that because landowners need to be able to, small family landowners need to be able to have incentives when they're waiting for the long term, some ways to make income throughout the lifetime. So anything that you would like to expand upon as it relates to those other sort of niche markets before we wrap up and open up to the audience for any questions?
Well, I'd like to add to what Patrick said previously about the risk and the long-term nature of the asset class. Families are having to make difficult decisions to spend substantial amounts of money to reforest in a lot of cases. The Farm Bill has different programs and money to help landowners reforest, whether it be from harvesting or from natural disasters or wildfires. That time frame in between when that initial investment is made or the initial cost happens to when trees will mature to where they could be turned into to wood products, there's a substantial amount of time. The alternative sources of income to help landowners, whether it be raking pine straw, sugaring operations in the Northeast, or recreational leases, snowmobile leases, all of those things help landowners maintain that stewardship for the property over that generational type investment horizon.
Yeah, certainly on our property, hunting leases are a very big source of income, and the per acre cost doesn't seem like a lot on an annual basis, but when you look at the whole at all of our land and what we bring in every year, it's pretty significant, and certainly it's a product that people are looking for in this day and age. And, whether it's hunting or any type of recreation, it's becoming very, very important to landowners.
So our largest member manages 13 million acres of forest land in the United States. Our smallest member manages 1,500. From 13 million to 1,500, everything in between, the common need of the forest and of those who manage it is the marketplace. There is this important symbiotic relationship between the forest and the markets that they serve. It may be counterintuitive, but notwithstanding the unprecedented increase in demands from our forests over the last half century and beyond. Since World War II, frankly, we have never demanded more from our forests. Everybody goes to Starbucks and gets a cup of coffee in the morning. They go onto Amazon.com and they get packages delivered to their home. We like to build homes. We like to live in homes. And we're doing more of that than ever. Yet because of those markets, we're not diminishing our forest resource. Our forest land base in the country stayed relatively stable over that period of time. And the volume of trees that we've been growing has actually increased 50%. And it's the evidence of this relationship between the marketplace and the forest. It's the marketplace that enables the investment, and it's the forest that provides the benefits to the marketplace, and the two have to work together well. And policies that enable that are really good for everyone. It's good for the forest, it's good for the environment, it's good for the American public. We're always excited about what the future holds, and there are wonderful things in the future. We have barely begun to unlock the benefits that we can obtain from our forests. We are now in possession of the technology that enables us to build very tall buildings out of wood, have all the same structural integrity and properties that you'd want from other materials that we use to build tall buildings. We are now understanding more the carbon change in wood, that it will enable us through nanotechnology to do things we haven't even dreamt of doing before, just because those carbon chains are so strong and so unique in nature. And so the bio-based products future is extremely bright in our country. And so this is one of those resources, you can't tell I kind of like this stuff, but it's one of those resources that will continue to give as we continue to learn about it. And that relationship between the markets, present and future, and the forest will continue to be there. And if we recognize it as what it is, a good thing, we will be blessed with thriving, sustainable forests in the future.
So many words of wisdom and insights from our panelists, and it is exciting to think about the future. We have a very strong and rich past. We're doing some exciting things now, but there's more to come. We received many nuggets and takeaways, I think, today, hearing from our panelists, but I would like to turn to them just in closing to see if there's anything else they'd like to share, a takeaway for you, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Sure, okay. Just in closing, I've come to DC several times over the last decade to get to visit the process, and I've experienced firsthand what the policies that are set here and how they can impact family forest in South Arkansas in a very dramatic way. And I see the need, and Representative Westerman also had mentioned earlier in his remarks of the need for a voice of forestry, and organizations like the Society of American Forests, the American Forest Foundation, and even at the local level, all of those organizations support the voice of forestry and are essential to help get the messaging to where it needs to go so we can continue to maximize and manage these natural resources the way we know how to.
I think a final thought would be going back to my college degree and learning how to ask questions. It's a place where policy is made. If you want to make good policy that has to do with this sector, ask a forester, ask a mill owner, ask someone who is investing of their time and their resources and who've invested their family and in their community in the proposition of growing and making wonderful things out of our forests. They'll give you good advice. They have for me.
Kind of going back on some things we've mentioned already. You hear a lot about agriculture. Not to take anything away from agriculture, it's certainly an important industry in this country. But and agriculture is very important to rural communities. But you don't hear near as much about forestry, and it's just as important, in some cases, some parts of the country, even more important than agriculture. And I think it's important that there is some debate in Washington about forestry policies and how our policies impact the forestry community. And you hear a lot about how certain policies affect Main Street, but there's a big difference in rural Main Street and urban Main Street. And rural communities, again, are very dependent on these, agriculture and forestry industries. And when we're talking about those effects, I think the effects that those policies have, I think it's important, as you said, to talk to the people that are being affected and go back to those rural communities and those industries that support those communities and know how those policies are going to affect the communities before they're implemented. And let's don't just change something at the last minute and hope for the best.
Well said. Thank you. So I'd like to open it up to our audience for any questions that you may have. Yes, ma'am.
I would like to follow up on the expansion of forest products markets and talk about public policy. We want to both sustain our traditional markets and we want to find new markets. I'm with forestry in Maryland. One of the biggest barriers that I see to sustainable forestry moving forward is going to be lack of markets. How can we both sustain the places that we have and are important to our rural economy, and also expand, so that some of this Baltimore, Washington corridor will have access in the future? Because looking at the forest health issues, they're going to need it. So is there anything about public policy that could help, or something about public policy right now that's hurting? Federal, state, local level, anything?
I'll take a little bit of a stab at that. Research and development is very important. The USDA spends, the Forest Products Lab, I guess, spends a fair amount of money every year researching different products. There's one bill we're trying to push through Congress to try to ensure that we get a little more funding for tall wood buildings and those kind of things. One issue that is affecting my industry, as far as the manufacturing industry, is the lack of markets for our residuals, for our wood chips and those type of things. And you've seen the pulp and paper industry in this country has diminished over the years, and I think it's very important that we do continue research to try to find other outlets for those products, because there was a time when the byproducts from mills were burned and we didn't care. Well, now that's a primary revenue stream for us. It's without that revenue stream, we're not going to stay in business. So it's very important that we do invest in those research dollars to find, as you alluded to, as Congressman Westerman mentioned the nanotechnology, and anything from that up to the tall wood buildings and mass timber and any kind of a product that can use any portion of that log is important to our industry, and absolutely investing in the research is essential.
And I'd also add that when you manage natural resources, defining objectives and programs that exist to help small landowners that might not have gone to forestry school, giving the direction to develop management plans is critical. And you might not be maximizing necessarily volume. A goal on a property could be more conservation related, defining your objectives as species diversification, aesthetical value, wildlife habitat. It's critical to define those objectives and to look at the market from that standpoint. And there are incentive programs out to help when those objectives are defined, to help guide landowners and provide the tools that they need to implement those plans. And so, research and development is absolutely critical, and also having active management. 85% of private landowners don't have active management plan. They're not foresters. They need the assistance in order to get that ecosystem moving in a positive direction. And so it takes that expertise and insight to help that process.
Regard our technical assistance and our incentive programs, that they're working and making a difference?
Absolutely.
And our public leaders are in a wonderful position to help provide the opportunities for markets. They don't necessarily have to create them, but they can provide the opportunities for them. And a good example of that is what USDA has done in recent years around the idea of tall wood buildings, providing the environment and, frankly, the cheerleading for that kind of technology to flourish. Because of that, we're going to be breaking ground probably early next year in Portland, Oregon, for a 14-story building made out of wood. And it's going to be a beautiful building, helping to orient, I think, those who are in a position to influence public policy around the idea that using wood is a good thing. And becoming those cheerleaders, that invites the innovation, that invites the research, that invites the investment, that invites the climate, frankly, that will enable us to do good things going forward. And USDA is a very vital player in that, and I think they will continue to be. The Farm Bill is a wonderful platform to highlight those kinds of things and to provide direction and incentive for having a forward-looking orientation around the use of wood.
I would add also, too, that it's important, I think, to engage our land-grant universities as well. Sometimes I think there's a disconnect between academia and industry and certain from time to time. And but just to make sure they understand that there is a need for research in those areas.
Other questions?
So I think a lot of us in the room understand that trees are an asset in addition to all these wonderful things they do. But I think the general public, even in a rural area, I live in a county that doesn't even have a traffic light in the entire county. And even then, people I talk to often, they ask me what I do. I say I'm a forestry consultant, and they say, well, they kind of look at you sideways. You know, what is that? Like your snake oil salesman or something. And the best analogy I can give them is I say I manage people's timber portfolio, similar to the way a stockbroker would manage a stock portfolio. And then the light comes on, but they don't really see trees as an asset. I know in the urban areas that's especially true. Then when you see in the media, like we just had Hurricane Irma, you've heard a lot of talk about homes, which tragic, people's homes destroyed. A lot of insured losses, though. On wildfires, you'll hear about so many houses burned up. In many cases, those are insured losses, but people, you don't hear about, Irma, we lost a tremendous amount of trees. And in wildfires, you'll see private landlords, maybe their entire investment wiped out overnight, one day. It's all burned up, but you don't hear anything on the media about that. So my question is to these guys, how do we get that word out to the media, to say on the news or whatever, 12 homes burned up, but we also lost, X millions of dollars worth of timber, or maybe play on some of these stories that aren't being told about timber losses.
I definitely acknowledge the difficulty that private landowners, even timber companies, have getting the attention from natural disasters, whether it be hurricanes or wildfires, and unless it's impacting urban developments and communities. that are being affected directly. Indirectly, the cost can be astronomical, and I certainly agree that oftentimes the media doesn't give the attention to the natural resources that have been affected by those areas. There are programs like in the Farm Bill, like EQIP, that assist landowners in recovering from disasters, whether it be assisting with cleanup operations, salvage operations, reforestation, and it's a win-win when you have assistance for landowners to help deal with those events. But from the public perception, it is challenging. I definitely see what you and acknowledge what you're experiencing as far as that outreach. I think it's going to be a continual effort to try to get the message out.
I'm not sure, I don't know that I really have an answer to your question, but I do think it's important that one landowner certainly isn't going to get the message out. I think it's important that we work together, whether it's through our state forestry associations or whatever group, to try to get that message out after those events, and to be able to convey that message. Because it's certainly more effective when you can give a much bigger, broader number of what the impact is, and especially if you can kind of tie that into the impacts of the industry on the state too, and how that affects your state as a whole.
The public at large is a pretty big bite. Probably too big to swallow, frankly, because they care about a lot of different things, and those things change from week to week in our society and culture now. But what we can do is we can ask ourselves the question, who can we reach? Who can we really reach, and focus on those we can really reach? It's really a concept of just kind of lifting where you stand, and I'll give you an example of that. Here in Congress, and we work a lot with the members of Congress, we asked ourselves the question, who can we reach and how in this sphere? Well, we know that we have a few members of Congress who actually understand us. They understand what we do. They understand the resource. They have a lot of colleagues who don't. And so the idea that came to mind was to form a caucus, a working forest caucus. Maybe have one in the House and the Senate that provides a forum for these members who do know, through their relationships, to educate those who may not. And now we have a caucus in the House that's chaired by Congressman Westerman, who was here earlier, Congressman Peterson from Minnesota, and we have one in the Senate that's chaired by Senator Risch from Idaho and Senator King from Maine. Bipartisan and filled with members, an increasing number of members who are not only know deeply about what we do, but are learning a lot about what we do, and then are in a position to educate their colleagues. That's just one example, but you can replicate that all over the place by simply asking the question, who truly can we reach? And focusing on them, and then taking the steps to lift where you stand. It's no secret. If you tell someone a good story, they'll be 22 times more likely to remember it than if you simply give them facts. Authentic storytelling is always helpful.
So true. Yes.
There's a question, perhaps. So I think I have data that I've seen that there's more than $1 billion a year really contributed to incentives and other programs from the federal government to help private forests and working forests for conservation purposes largely, which is laudable and hopefully will provide opportunities to continue. And actually, I was just out in California 3 weeks ago on an SAF visit for one of the SAF meetings out there, and they were talking about the carbon programs there. I think this is another opportunity maybe. I'm curious what you all think is by actually at the conference held 3 weeks ago in Portland, they said that the carbon markets in the U.S. now are about 50 million, okay, compared with 1 billion for the conservation programs coming from the government, which is nascent markets, but with considerable opportunities for, if not a federal level expansion on the West Coast and maybe expansion in other regions. I'm kind of curious what your views are about the merits of these markets and, certainly forests have a lot to contribute there, and maybe the cheapest way to contribute to reducing carbon emissions or net carbon. But about policy components of that, certainly the policy-driven market economy.
Yeah, foresters have been sequestering carbon, from the very beginning, and but markets and incentive programs for foresters to do the good work that they are doing and landowners to do is obviously something that can help provide alternative income sources for a property. I think that there could be challenges with a balancing act of maintaining a working, sustainably managed forest, or focusing strictly on carbon, because there's a balance of the natural resources and the benefits that come off of a forest. So I could see challenges with that, but private landowners look for opportunities to exist and to maintain their generational type forests and assets. And so I would welcome a viable market to participate in.
As a landowner, I'm all for carbon credits or whatever, because essentially you can be paid for doing what you've always done. It's managing your timberland well. But I think it's important that we have a conversation in this country about what the end result really is from all this. Most airlines, if you take a flight, you can buy carbon credits to offset your carbon footprint of your flight. Well, if I'm just buying that credit and it's paying a timberland owner to do what they've always done, then we've done nothing to help the environment. We've just shuffled some money around, and it's great for the landowner, as I said. If you want to pay me for that, I'm fine with that. But what exactly is the benefit of these programs, and are we really achieving what we want to achieve? And most of the programs I've seen are probably not really doing a whole lot environmentally, and I think it's important that we really talk about what we want from these programs and what the end result should be.
I was reflecting on an email I received just in the last day or two from one of the foremost forest carbon experts in the world, and very, very smart person. And the point that he was making was that possibly the most important carbon mitigation factor of all in this, in the use of our forests in the carbon future of our world was markets. That a marketplace that sustains the continued growth and renewal of our forests was perhaps the most important single factor. And so I think that as we're looking at whether it's a policy-induced market or the traditional market or a new market, it's markets. And markets are going to provide those carbon benefits going forward. I'll just make the claim, and others can dispute later, but forests are the most important carbon story on the planet, at least from our view. And understanding how to unlock that and sustain that potential, even grow it in the future, it's going to take markets.
It's going to take markets and all of us working together, recognizing that we are very interdependent and that we all need to care. I think some of the points that were made today certainly drive home the importance of working forests, but to also look at the importance of being a champion and a cheerleader for forestry and sustainable forests. I think we can make the case that forests are really vital to our national security. When you think about the dependence of our rural communities, the economy, how we're all dependent in various ways with our forests. So thinking about that, how do we really champion that? How do we make sure that forestry is seen as an important part of our infrastructure and that we invest in it long term in various ways? And certainly making sure that that toolbox is larger, and there are many, many tools and incentives in that to keep our forests as forests. I'm a big believer that trees, forests, and natural resources are the solution not only to many of our economic challenges and environmental challenges, but our social challenges. And we have many of those today. So how do we step up and step into that space as forestry professionals and as leaders, decision makers? We all play a role, whether we're mayors or congressional staff, or we own a business or own forest land back home. I'd like to thank our panelists. I think they've done a tremendous job today, and so if I may ask for a round of applause for them.